Hello and welcome to my video on beginning to work on Dell Chromebook 3100 and 3110 charging ports. I will have to say I am not an expert in this field. I have just spent the last year kind of messing with it and learning as I go. I do recommend, if you haven't soldered before, to watch a soldering safety video. Jumping right into the tools necessary to complete this job. So this is my workstation, and it is quite a mess. I've tried cleaning the mat. I've had a lot of issues with that, but it does get the job done. I do heavily recommend a silicone mat. That way it protects your tables and things from getting too much heat on them, and it's just generally helpful to work with and have the different slots. So we first have our Sonar hot air station. It is a relatively cheap hot air station and soldering station that works relatively well. You can set the temperature on it. I normally set the hot air to about 430, 440 and the solder to 420. That's just what I've experimented with and had the best luck with. We then have our lead solder. Now I do recommend you have a fan or some kind of thing to pull the solder fumes away from you, because it is lead solder. I'm using 1.8% flux, 60/40 tin lead, 0.6 millimeter diameter. I then use flux because I find flux very helpful in making sure I don't overflow the solder. This is Kester 186. A solder sucker is something that's going to be necessary. It's going to make your life a lot easier. And then a good pair of tweezers I also recommend. Now you don't have to have it, but I like having a toothbrush and rubbing alcohol just to kind of clean the flux off the board when I am done with it. Okay, now to get started with our 3100 board here, you're going to see this metal piece. We're just going to remove it. The way I do this, that will not be able to put back on because it will cause shorts. The other little metal piece that's a brace, you can put that back on when you're done. I start by applying some flux to the old solder, and then I will put some new lead solder on there just to reduce the melting temperature. This is not entirely necessary, as your pins on the underside of the board can't get new solder on them, and so they will take a second to heat up. I like to solder all the little holes there too. Just make sure to get solder in all of it. We will be removing this when we start taking the port off. Once my solder is in place, I will start up my hot air station and we'll start applying heat to all these points. I try not to directly heat the port itself. I will place the port here so that it is elevated above this. That way it has room to fall down when it has had enough heat. You do not want to apply a lot of pressure to this port. If you apply a lot of pressure, you will rip traces, and that will make repair very difficult, if not impossible, at our current skill levels. Now, when applying heat, you will eventually start using your solder sucker to remove solder, but I get impatient and you will see me use it earlier than I should. It doesn't really hurt anything. I like to start with getting the corners nearest to the edge first, because the back of the board is where the pins are located that will have to be heated from the other side. So we're just going to work our way around, keep getting all this solder out of the holes. Sometimes it will be stubborn and will not want to come out. So now we've got to the point where we're trying to heat up those pins that are on the back. And you see the port has actually fallen off on its own. And so from here, we're going to flip the board over and we're going to apply heat to the other side and go over with our solder sucker to make sure all the solder is out. This again is not a necessary step if you wish to heat it up and drop your port in that way. I like to remove the solder. That way I just have to worry about getting the underneath pins connected solidly. So at this point, I like to turn my board sideways. I will move the old port out of the way. And then I'll come back in and I'll tin the little pads that are necessary for the bottom. I try not to get tin in any of the other holes because I find it kind of difficult to heat that back up. And so it's easier to drop the port on. You will sometimes get new ports that have some slightly bent pins, and that will cause you some issues. So always check your port's pins to make sure they're nice and straight before you try to put them on. I like to grab the port by the back legs. That's what I found easiest to get on. So I'm going to start applying hot air now. We're going to heat that whole board up. There is a piece you want to be careful of right below the port that can come off. So make sure you blow your hot air towards the outside of the board, not towards the inside where the components are. So I tried putting it in there and I didn't get it lined up quite right. So I'm going to heat the board back up. Come in and try to drop it in. I've got it on there. I want to press down and kind of heat the back up. Make sure that we get that back nice and solid. It's not setting as well as I want it to, so I'm messing with it here. It will set into place when it is in the correct location and all the pins are lined up. So now we remove heat, hold it down. So I've now flipped the board over and I'm going to apply solder and fill those holes back in. You have to do this before testing because if you don't, the other pins are not strong enough, and when you plug in a charger, you will most likely rip the port off the board and again can cause trace damages. I apply a little flux here because the flux kind of makes it settle a lot nicer in those tiny holes. Those tiny holes, by the way, are what prevent you from putting the metal piece back in. If you were to fill those in on the other side, you could probably reattach the metal piece. But I find that a lot more difficult, so I stick with this method. I'll use my toothbrush and rubbing alcohol to clean up the flux, make it look a little nicer. And now we're going to test. We see we get charging light. Flip it over, and we get our charging light. I like to wiggle the board a little bit, make sure that it's on there nice and strong, because it is easy to not get it on there that strongly and then you put it inside the board. This user has broken their port multiple times, so I am going to add solder on the top layer just to add a tiny bit more strength. And that is how to change a charging port on a 3100. If you do have issues, I recommend, if you have issues getting one set of pins to go, I recommend flipping the board over and applying pressure from the back as you heat it up and press it down on a flat surface. I've had good luck with that, setting the ports correctly. And here's a quick zoom in to kind of show you the pieces here I'm talking about right below the port. They do sometimes come off, but with enough practice you can actually pick it up, run some leaded solder over the area, run some flux over there to make sure that nothing's shorting together, and you can put the piece back on. With a little bit of practice, it's not actually that hard to do. Okay, and now for some bonus content. This is going to be how to change a USB port. It is very similar to a USB-C port. You're going to add some leaded solder. Thankfully, we don't have to deal with the pins under the board this time, so this one is actually easier. So we're just going to add leaded solder to every single pin. And not using flux on the USB port because it is very easy to accidentally get the flux inside of the port. From here, we're going to come in with a hot air. Be careful with the pins on the bottom of the port, as the port back is open and you can very easily melt the plastic. So kind of try to aim away from the USB port itself. I forgot to mention, but another important thing is to, again, have the port elevated some so that it can fall down off the board when it is ready to. So from here, I've decided to start putting in putting on some pressure and heating up the ports because I can't get all the solder out. So I'm just using my solder sucker to apply a tiny bit of pressure. This doesn't have traces that are as easy to tear, so you can apply more pressure on this than you would apply on a USB-C port. And now we have the port off. We are going to go back through, flip the board over, make sure all of our holes are completely cleared of solder. Now that we have the port off, it's very easy to take the new port and you're going to slot it into place. Be careful, your board will be hot. And make sure that all the pins go in. It will kind of hold itself in there. Flip the board over and now fill all the holes with solder. And I do recommend on the back pins using a tiny bit of flux. Just be very careful with it, and that way it prevents any shorts. The flux will clean things up. You do not want to go too crazy with your solder. And I mean, that's how to change a USB port. Another bonus is changing the audio jack. Now this one's a lot harder to do because you cannot use hot air. So you're going to, of course, come in and add your leaded solder as you would pretty much anything you're doing. It'll just lower the melting temperature. And then from there, we're going to use our soldering iron and heat up each point. And just come in with the solder sucker and get it the best we can. Watch out for pieces coming out of your solder sucker. Once the solder is cleared as well as we can clear it, I like to apply some pressure and come back through with my iron and try to hit as many of those points as I can at once with the iron. Too much pressure and you can mess up the audio port, but in this case the audio port is bad, so we don't really entirely care. You can see it now comes out. I apply a little bit to the other side. We're going to come in with the hot air now that the plastic jack is gone, and we're going to clear all these holes out and make sure they're completely clear. And now that it's clear, we're going to press the jack into place just like we would with the USB. And we're going to make sure it's snapped in there. And then we're going to come in and add our leaded solder. And you should have a working jack. Thanks for watching. Hope I provided some help. And good luck on your repairs.